picking up Livy, book 33, again reading from section 41. This wrangling had lasted a number of days when a rumor was reported, though it could not be verified, that Ptolemy had died, and this meant that the discussions reached no conclusion. Both sides, in fact, pretended not to have heard the rumor. Lucius Cornelius charged with the mission to the two kings. Antiochus and Ptolemy requested a short interval to meet Ptolemy, his intention being to reach Egypt before there could be any upheaval at the time of the new king's succession. Antiochus, for his part, thought that Egypt would be his if he overran it at that time. He therefore dismissed the Romans, left his son Seleucus and the land forces to continue his planned reconstruction of Lysimachia, and himself sailed to Ephesus with the He therefore dismissed the Romans, left his son Seleucus and the land forces to continue his planned reconstruction of the Lysimachia, and himself sailed to Ephesus with his entire fleet, having first sent envoys to Quinctius to discuss their alliance, and thereby give him assurance that the king would do nothing to change it. Skirting the coast of Asia, Antiochus reached Lycia, and on learning at Patara that Ptolemy was still alive, he abandoned his plan of sailing to Egypt. Even so, he headed for Cyprus. After rounding the promontory of Chelidonia, however, he was held up for a short time in the area of the Eurymedon River in Pamphylia by a mutiny of his oarsmen. When he had moved forward from there, a terrible storm arose around the so-called mouths of the river Sarus, which almost sank him and his entire fleet. Many of his ships were disabled and many driven ashore. Many were so completely swallowed up by the sea that no one managed to swim to shore. Large numbers of men perished in this incident, not just a nameless herd of rowers and common soldiers, but some illustrious courtiers of the king as well. After he brought together what remained after the wreck, Antiochus was in no position to launch an expedition to Cyprus, and so he returned to Seleucia with a retinue far less grand than at his departure. There he ordered the ships to be drawn up on land, since winter was already coming on, and he himself withdrew to winter quarters in Antioch. This was how matters stood with the kings. 42. In Rome, this was the first year that the triumviri Apollones were elected, and Gaius Licinius Lucullus, the plebeian tribune, who had proposed the law regarding their election, Publius Manlius and Publius Porcius Laeca, were chosen. This triumvirate was given the legal right, also accorded the pontiffs, to wear the toga praxtexa. This triumvirate was given the legal right, also accorded the pontiffs, to wear the toga praetexta. That year, however, the urban quaestors, Quintus Fabius Labeo and Lucius Aurelius, were involved in a bitter struggle with all the priests. Money was needed because it had been decided that private individuals should be paid the last installment of the money they had contributed towards the war, and the quaestors were dunning the augurs and pontiffs for the taxes they had not paid during the period of the war. The priests pleaded in vain with the tribunes of the people, and an amount was collected to cover all the years of non-payment. The same year 2 pontiffs died and were replaced by new ones. The consul Marcus Marcellus succeeded Gaius Sempronius Tuditanus, who had died while holding the praetorship in Spain, and Lucius Valerius Flaccus succeeded Marcus Cornelius Cethegus. The augur Quintus Fabius Maximus also died at a very young age, and before he could hold any magistracy, but no augur was chosen to replace him that year. The consular elections were then conducted by the consul Marcus Marcellus and Lucius Valerius Flaccus, and Marcus Porcius Cato were elected. The following were then chosen as praetors: Gnaeus Manlius Vulso, Appius Claudius Nero, Publius Porcius Laeca, Gaius Fabricius Licinius, Gaius Atinius Labeo, and Publius Manlius. That year the curule aediles Marcus Fulvius Nobilior and Gaius Flaminius distributed 1,000,000 measures of grain to the people at a price of 2 asses per measure. The grain had been brought to Rome by the people of Sicily in homage to Gaius Flaminius and his father, and Flaminius had shared the credit for the distribution with his colleague. The Roman games were celebrated with great ceremony, and were repeated 3 times in their entirety. The plebeian aediles, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus and Gaius Scribonius Curio, arraigned a large number of cattle breeders before the people. 3 were found guilty, and from the fines exacted from them the aediles built a temple of Faunus on the island. The plebeian games were repeated over a second 2-day period, and a banquet was held in honor of the games. 43. On the Ides of March, the day of their entry into office, the consuls Lucius Valerius Flaccus and Marcus Porcius Cato referred to the Senate the matter of their provinces. The senators took account of the war in Spain, escalating at such a rate as to require both a consular general and a consular army, and decided that the consuls should have as provinces, by mutual agreement or by allotment, hither Spain and Italy respectively. The man receiving Spain as his province was to transport with him 2 legions, 15,000 infantry of the allies and the Latin League, and 800 cavalry, and also take 20 warships. The other consul was to enroll 2 legions sufficient to hold the province of Gaul, since the spirit of the Insubres and Boii had been broken in the previous year. Cato drew Spain as his province, and Valerius Italy, and then the praetors drew as follows: Gaius Fabricius Lucinus, city jurisdiction; Gaius Atinius Labeo, jurisdiction of foreigners; Gnaeus Manlius Vulso, Sicily; Appius Claudius Nero, farther Spain; Publius Porcius Laeca, Pisae, so the praetor could be to the rear of the Ligures. Publius Manlius was made consular aid for hither Spain, since there were now concerns about the Spartan tyrant Nabis, as well as about Antiochus and the Aetolians. Titus Quintius' imperium was extended for a period of a year with the command of 2 legions. The consuls were authorized to enroll and send to Macedonia any forces that might be needed to supplement these. Apart from having command of the legion formerly under Quintius Fabius, Appius Claudius was also permitted to enlist 2,000 infantry and 200 new cavalry. The same number of new infantry and cavalry was also assigned to Publius Manlius for service in hither Spain, and he was further given the legion that had been under the command of the praetor Quintus Minucius. Publius Porcius Laeca was also officially allocated 10,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry from the army in Gaul for service around Pisae. In Sardinia, Tiberius Sempronius Longus had his imperium prolonged. 44. Such was the allocation of the provinces. Before the consuls could leave the city, they were instructed, following a decree by the pontiffs, to carry out the sacred spring that the praetor Aulus Cornelius Mamula had promised in a vow during the consulship of Gnaeus Servilius and Gaius Flaminius, in accordance with decision of the Senate and a vote of the people. The rite was performed 21 years after the vow was made. In the same period, Gaius Claudius Pulcher, son of Appius, was elected and installed as augur as a replacement for Quintus Fabius Maximus, who had died the previous year. While the public was now expressing surprise over the indifference that was being shown towards the war started by Spain, a letter arrived from Quintus Minucius with the news that he had fought a successful pitched battle with the Spanish commanders, Budares and Basadines, near the town of Turda. 12,000 of the enemy had been killed, Minucius said, with Budares, the commander, taken prisoner and the others defeated and put to flight. After the letter was read out, there was less alarm regarding Spain, where a momentous war had been expected. All concern was now focused instead on King Antiochus, especially after the arrival of the 10 commissioners. The latter first reported on their dealings with Philip and the terms on which he had been granted peace, and then explained that the Romans were threatened with a war no less serious with Antiochus. The king had crossed to Europe with a mighty fleet and a first-rate land army, they said, and had he not been distracted by a flimsy hope arising from an even flimsier rumor of invading Egypt, he would soon have brought the flame of war to Greece, for the Aetolians would not remain inactive either. They were by nature an unruly people, and they also bore a grudge against the Romans. There was also another great cancer fixed in the entrails of Greece, Nabis, currently tyrant of the Spartans, but soon to be tyrant of all Greece, if given the chance, a man who rivaled all the notorious tyrants in greed and brutality. If he were allowed to hold Argos, which dominates the Peloponnese like a citadel, when the Roman armies have been taken back to Italy, then the liberation of Greece from Philip will have been for nothing. Instead of a king who, if nothing else, was far removed, the Greeks would be ruled by a tyrant close at hand. 45. When they heard this from the lips of such authoritative witnesses, men who were then bringing reports entirely based on their own inquiries, they felt that the major problem was that of Antiochus, but the discussion focused on the tyrant was now more urgent, since the king had for some reason withdrawn into Syria. There was a long debate on whether they appeared to have sufficient grounds for declaring war, or whether they should give Titus Quintius the authority to do what he felt was in the interest of the state with regard to the Spartan Nabis. They did give Quintius this authority, because they thought it not of great importance to the highest interest of the state whether action on the matter came sooner or later. Of greater concern was what the reaction of Hannibal and the Carthaginians would be to war breaking out with Antiochus. Men belonging to the faction opposed to Hannibal had been writing time and again to their respective friends amongst the leading Romans to say that messengers and letters had been sent to Antiochus by Hannibal, and that envoys had come secretly to Hannibal from the king. Some wild animals could not be tamed by any means, they said, and this man's disposition was equally fierce and recalcitrant. He would complain that his city-state was atrophying in listless inactivity, was drowning in inertia, and that only the noise of weaponry could wake her up. What gave plausibility to these statements was the recollection of the last war, of which Hannibal alone was prosecutor as well as instigator. In addition to this, he had ruffled the feelings of many of the important people by his recent conduct. 46. At that time, power in Carthage lay with the order of judges, mainly because judges had life tenure of office. Everybody's material well-being, reputation, and survival rested in these men's hands. Anyone falling foul of a single member of that order had them all against him, and there was no shortage of people to bring a charge against him before these unsympathetic judges. While these men were enjoying their absolute authority, for they did not exercise their exceptional powers as citizens should, Hannibal, who had been elected praetor, ordered a quaestor summoned to him. The quaestor completely ignored him, for not only was he a member of the faction opposed to Hannibal, but he was also in the process of being promoted from the quaestorship to the supreme order, that of the judges, and was already adopting the arrogance in keeping with the power soon to be his. Hannibal found his behavior totally unacceptable and sent an officer to arrest the quaestor. He then brought the man before the assembly, where he launched an attack not so much on the individual concerned, but on the order of judges. Before their arrogant manipulation of power, he said, neither the laws nor the magistrates counted for anything, observing that his speech was falling on willing ears, and that the judges' arrogance infringed the liberty of the lower orders as well. He immediately promulgated and carried a law limiting the election of judges to a period of a single year and barring anyone from being a judge for 2 years in succession. The appreciation this move won for him with the masses was commensurate. The appreciation this move won for him with the masses was commensurate with the offense he gave to most of the nobility. Another of his actions also stirred up personal animosities amongst him. Another of his actions also stirred up personal animosities against him, though it was taken in the public interest. The public revenues were trickling away partly through poor administration, and partly because they were divided up as spoils amongst certain noblemen and the magistrates. There was, accordingly, a shortage of money to pay the annual tribute to the Romans, and private citizens seemed to be faced with heavy taxation. 47. Hannibal turned his attention to the amount of taxes collected on land and sea transportation of goods, and the items on which these taxes were dispersed, noting the portion of them consumed by normal expense of state, and how much was diverted by misappropriation. He then announced before the assembly that if all moneys that were now due were collected, the state would be sufficiently solvent to pay the tribute to the Romans without having to tax private citizens, and he made good his assurance of this. At this point, the men who had grown fat on embezzlement of public funds over a number of years became furiously angry, feeling they were being deprived of their own property rather than relieved of loot gained by theft, and they began to incite the Romans, who were looking for an excuse to vent their hatred on him anyway, to take action against Hannibal. For a long time Publius Scipio Africanus opposed this, feeling, as he did, that it was not in keeping with the dignity of the Roman people to put the seal of approval on the antipathies of Hannibal's accusers, and link official support with the factions of Carthage. It was as if they were dissatisfied with having defeated Hannibal in war, he thought, if they now had to act as accusers, swearing to the legitimacy of the allegations and bringing charges against him. Eventually, however, Hannibal's accusers persuaded the Senate to send a delegation to Carthage to lay before the Carthaginian Senate their accusations that Hannibal was plotting war along with Antiochus. Three envoys were sent: Gnaeus, Servilius, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, and Quintus Terentius Coleo. Arriving in Carthage, these followed the advice of Hannibal's enemies, and when people asked the reason for their visit, had the answer given that they had come to settle the differences that the Carthaginians were having with Massinissa, king of Numidia. This gained general acceptance, and only Hannibal was not fooled. He could see that it was he who was the real target of the Romans, that the granting of peace to the Carthaginians was dependent on a relentless war continuing against him alone. He decided accordingly to yield to circumstances and fortune. He had already prepared everything in advance for his escape, and now he spent the day in the Forum to avert suspicion. At dusk he proceeded to one of the city gates, dressed in his city clothes, with two companions who had no idea of what he had in mind. 48. Horses were waiting on the spot where he had instructed. He crossed by night the area in the region known as Byzaxium, arriving the following day at his castle on the sea between Acylla and Thapsus. Acylla spelt Acylla, Fyi. There a ship was awaiting him, fitted out and manned with a crew, and on this Hannibal left Africa, bemoaning his country's fate more often than his own. That same day he crossed to the island of Sarcina. Here he found in port a number of Phoenician merchant vessels loaded with cargo, and when he disembarked, a crowd gathered as people came to greet him. When people asked about him, he had the answer given that he was on a diplomatic mission to Tyre. Even so, he was afraid that one of these ships might set off at night and take the news to Thapsus or Hadrumetum. Even so, he was afraid that one of these ships might set off at night and take the news to Thapsus or Hadrumetum that he had been spotted on Sarcina. He therefore gave orders for a sacrifice to be prepared and had the ship captains and traders invited to it. He also issued instructions for the sails and spars to be gathered from the ships to form a sunshade. It happened to be midsummer for his guests who were dining on the shore. On that day the banquet was held with all the lavishness permitted by the circumstances and time, and the party was drawn out till late at night, with heavy drinking. As soon as Hannibal found the occasion to give those in the port the slip, he set sail. The other diners were asleep, and when the next day they finally awoke from their slumber, still well under the influence of the drink, not only was it late, but they spent several hours carrying the rigging back to the ships and then setting it up and adjusting it. In Carthage, the large number of people who usually visited Hannibal's house gathered at the entrance to the building. In Carthage, the large numbers of people who usually visited Hannibal's house gathered at the entrance to the building, and word spread that he was nowhere to be found. A crowd then converged on the forum demanding their leading citizen. There were loud murmurings, some saying that he had escaped, which was actually the case, but others, and these were the majority, that he had been treacherously murdered by the Romans. One could see the various expressions that one expects to find in a community where loyalties are divided between different parties and which is split by factions. Then finally word was brought that Hannibal had been sighted on Cercina. 49. The Roman envoys declared in the Carthaginian Senate that the Roman senators had learned that Philip had earlier made war on the Roman people, mainly because he had been incited to do so by Hannibal. They had also learned that dispatches and messages had of late been sent by Hannibal to Antiochus and the Aetolians. Hannibal had, they said, developed plans for provoking Carthage to rebellion, and the destination of his present journey was undoubtedly Antiochus's court. He would not rest until he had fomented war the whole world over. His actions should not go unpunished, they said, if the Carthaginians wished to satisfy the Roman people that none of his activities had their approval or were officially sanctioned. The Carthaginians replied that they would do whatever the Romans considered fair. Hannibal had a good journey to Tyre, where he was welcomed by the founders of Carthage as a man of distinction, crowned with all manner of honors, and coming from their second fatherland. He remained a few days in Tyre, and then sailed on to Antioch. There he was told that the king had already left for Asia, and he met Antiochus's son, who was engaged in the seasonal celebration of the games at Daphne. Hannibal was given a warm welcome by him, but did not retard his voyage. At Ephesus, he overtook the king. The latter was still vacillating and ambivalent about the war with Rome, but Hannibal's arrival was no minor influence in bringing him to a decision to act. At this same time, the Aetolians also abandoned their alliance with Rome. Their envoys had been asking for the return of Pharsalus, Lucus, and certain other states in accordance with the terms of their original treaty, only to be referred by the Senate to Titus Quinctius. End of Book 33.